Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Real Next webinar series. Today we are talking about authoritative investment analysis with Real Next Market Edge. I'm Jeff Finn and joined today by Dr. Jeffrey Fisher. Dr. Fisher is Professor Emeritus at Indiana University Kelley School of Business, President and Chair of Homer Hoyt Institute. He is a Real Next Director and a consultant to NAPRE, also author of Real Estate Finance and Investment and Property Valuation. So well positioned to help us and help you in learning how to provide authoritative investment analysis. So Jeff is going to take over, walk through the foundations of investment analysis, and then how you can apply it within Market Edge to create the types of reports and presentations that will enable your clients to make effective sale and purchase decisions. So Jeff, let me get you the keys here and you'll be good to go. As always, we are recording this and we'll be sharing it after the session and open for questions along the way. So if you have any, please post them and we will address them. I'll either interject during the presentation or we'll wrap up at the end with the Q&A session. Jeff, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Let me switch my screens here. All right, so I assume you can see my screen.
Yes.
As Jeff said, I'm going to talk about how to do investment analysis with the Real Next Market Edge, one of my favorite topics to talk about. I remember Andy Florence, the founder and CEO of CoStar, one time introducing me to his team as the inventor of discounted cash flow analysis. That's not really true, but I do love to talk about how to do discounted cash flow analysis for investment analysis. And actually the Real Next Market Edge could also be thought of as a way to do valuation, because it's all really the same calculations. It's just whether you're solving for the rate of return or you're solving for the value given some return that you think investors want. So one of the things I like to emphasize is that you got to think about the money involved. Took this, from the movie, Show Me the Money. And mistakes that I've seen people make a lot of times when they're doing discounted cash flow analysis is they don't think about the cash that's involved. They get hung up in looking at accounting types of stuff. And you got to think, okay, what matters is how much money do I put into the investment and how much money do I get back out, including when I'm going to sell it. So what I like to do is go through the different steps in doing a discounted cash flow analysis. So we'll review the concepts behind a lease by lease discounted cash flow analysis. I want you to understand, sort of what we're trying to do when we do an investment analysis, as much as just how to do it in Market Edge. We'll see some examples, one example in Market Edge, but more important, I think, or at least as important, that you really understand the concepts and what we're trying to do. I remember teaching a course one year for the Appraisal Institute on using Argus to do the discounted cash flow lease by lease analysis. And it was like at the end of a full day webinar, somebody said, now, are we doing lease by lease analysis? It's like, what? We just talked about how to enter in all the lease information, and maybe we hadn't used the term lease by lease, but when we do an investment analysis, most of the time we're trying to capture the exact leases that are used on the property. In some cases we may not have to, if it's an apartment project, a hotel, or whatever, but we're going to learn how you can capture all the leases on the property. So concepts are the same for all lease by lease programs, whether you're using Argus or Real Next Market Edge or some other program, or even if you're using Excel. So as I alluded to before, it applies both to investment analysis and valuation or appraisal. Investment analysis is calculating a return given a purchase price. You could also use the program to have development rather than a purchase price. We're not going to talk about that today. We've done separate webinars in the past on how to use the development portion of the program. Instead of the purchase price, you'd have all your different development costs. But same idea, what money do you have to put in up front? And then investment analysis is calculating a return and other measures that you care about. But probably the return is one of the most important one, which could be before or after tax. We're going to calculate both of those in the market edge. And then valuation is all the same inputs, except we're going to put in a rate of return that we think an investor would want and solve for the purchase price that would result in that rate of return. And that's your value. If it's a return for a typical investor, then we would say, well, that's the market value of the property, because that's what a typical investor would pay to get that rate of return. And then we'll talk about I'm going to use an office building, just kind of a simplified example, but no matter how complicated the property is, it's all the same idea. It's just you have more leases to deal with for the most part, maybe a little bit more complexity in some other areas. And then it's an example that you can actually use yourself if you want to. I'll show you how you can get that example in Market Edge through the community area where you can share files with people. It's an example that I actually have in my real estate finance and investments textbook. I had that on the first screen. I didn't talk about the textbook, but in my textbook that's used at a lot of universities around the country and actually in several different countries, I have an example of how to do investment analysis in different chapters. And then I also show in an appendix how you can use Market Edge to get the exact same answer. So I like to start off with what I call the basic ingredients of a discounted cash flow analysis. And as we go along, if you have any questions, Jeff will be monitoring them, and no problem interrupting me, because this is for you all to ask any questions that you have on what we're trying to do when we do an investment analysis, so we can help you use the tool in the best way you can. So we have to think of some holding period. We're going to hold this property for 5 years, 10 years, whatever, and sell it. So what rate of return do we get, taking into consideration that we're going to sell it at some point in time? You could, assume that it's just going to go on and on for 40, 50 years. Used to be Japanese investors would ask for that type of analysis, but typically we say, we're only good at forecasting for at most 10 years. I would say 90% of the time I see 10 years in any type of investment analysis or valuation. And then we say, okay, let's just assume we're going to sell it at the end of the 10 years and then calculate our return over that 10-year holding period. As I say, in theory, it doesn't really matter. If I'm going to sell it after 5 years, the buyer is looking at the income that they're going to get, over the next 5 or 10 years. So the resale price is really, in theory, the present value of all the income after that. But it's usually easier to estimate a value after, say, 10 years when we have a little bit more visibility on sort of what leases look like up to that point in time, and what a reasonable way to estimate that resale price would be, which I'll come back to a little bit later. So again, we're going to try to capture all the existing leases over that holding period, and then estimate the resale price at the end of the holding period. So we need to project the income from the existing leases. So we're going to put in the current rent. Lots of different ways of putting it in most programs like Market Edge, whether it's on a per square foot basis or per unit basis, which would be more typical for, say, apartments. There could be fixed steps in the lease. There could be CPI adjustments, which used to be real common. I haven't seen that in quite a few years, which is a little surprising given, we just came off some fairly high inflation, but I haven't really seen those CPI adjustments in leases for quite a while. Fixed steps aren't quite the same thing, because you never know if inflation is going to be more or less than what was expected. So the idea of CPI adjustments was to adjust for exactly what inflation was, usually some percentage of whatever the increase in the CPI was. There could be contingent income, like percentage rents on retail space. So we need to account for that. And then a really important one, and probably the next to capturing all the details of the leases in terms of the rental income would be capturing the expense reimbursements, which is really part of the rental income. The idea being that some portion of the expenses could be the responsibility of the owner. And I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Responsibility of the tenant. Of course, some portion would be or could be a responsibility of the owner, but what we're talking about with expense reimbursements is passing through some of those expenses to the tenant. Usually it's passed through above some, let's call it a stop, like $5 per square foot. So if the expenses start off in the lease at $5 a square foot, the owner might say, okay, I'll pay the first $5, but anything above that gets passed through the tenant as an expense pass through. So that's additional rental income. Commissions a lot of times are based on that expense pass through. So I know I'm sure several of you are interested in that. So you want to make sure that any property management fees, are taken into consideration, that there could be expense pass-throughs. There could be some other income, vending, laundry, telecommunications, parking. So that would be part of the inputs that we need. And then one of the more complicated questions maybe is what happens when that lease comes up for renewal? Any renewal options in the existing leases? If so, what's a reasonable estimate of, or maybe we know from the lease exactly what the renewal rate will be, so we can put that into the program. But we also need to say, well, what are market rents are going to be when that lease comes up for renewal? And some programs we don't do this in Market Edge, and it's actually a simple calculation, but some programs like Argus require you to put in the market rent for a new tenant and the market rent if it's an existing tenant that renews their lease. So the idea would be a new tenant might pay $15, but if the existing tenant stays, you're going to only charge $14 per square foot. And then what you have to do is put in a renewal probability. So you'd say, well, there's a 75% chance that the lease is going to be renewed. So all the program does is take 75% of the $15 and let's see, make sure I get that right. So renewal is 75%. So yeah, 75% of the $14, right? So 75% chance of renewal. And if it's an existing tenant that renews, they're going to be $14. So 75% of $14, 25% of $15, you get $14.25. And then the program just uses $14.25 as the market rent. And then what it does is project out what the market rent will be when the lease renews. You'd have some growth rate in the program for market rents. One of the problems with that is market rents don't usually grow at some nice, neat rate every year. And we take a little different approach in Market Edge and ask you to put in what you think market rents will be at the time that the lease renews, which could be going through a similar process as this that you do before putting the inputs into the program, and just say, okay, here's what I think it would be today, and then I think it's going to grow at some rate, but you also may think that the market is going to look a lot better, kind of like the market right now, right? It's probably going to hopefully recover pretty strongly over the next couple of years, and above average growth in market rents until things kind of settle down again. And so we might want to project a higher rate for a couple of years, and then have things level off. So there may be some what we call rent spikes for a couple of years. We'll do a market update webinar in a couple of weeks and try to give you the latest things that I'm seeing in terms of what's happening with the market and rental rates and cap rates and rates of return and so forth that people are earning and transactions. But everything I'm seeing so far is looking pretty good for a recovery. Will there be additional TIs when that lease rolls over? So we've been talking about what happens when a lease renews. And one of the reasons you might have a lower rent on a lease renewal is that you don't have to pay the same amount of tenant improvements, because those are pretty much already in place if it's an existing tenant. and you're not going to have the vacancy. So all those things would be part of what you would put into the program. So you'd actually have to put in the amount of TIs if you think the lease is going to renew versus the TIs if it's not renewed. Then there could be leasing commissions that are different for a new versus a renewal tenant. And as I mentioned, there could be vacancy. Okay. A lot of ingredients here, but again, be sure to ask any questions if you have any on things. These are all, again, no matter what program you're doing for investment analysis or valuation, it's all the same inputs. We also have to ask if there's any space that's currently vacant, and if so, is it going to stay vacant? Hopefully not. So then how fast will it be absorbed and at what rate? So it's kind of like leasing space, but we're starting with the space being empty, and then projecting out how long it's going to take for it to be leased up. Then we have the operating expenses. Sometimes I see people get confused, say, well, we just talked about expense reimbursements. Well, the owner still has to pay the operating expenses. It's just that they'll be able to pass through some of that maybe to the tenants, but you still have to pay the operating expenses. So here what I'm talking about is the expenses in total that the owner has to pay, whether they get reimbursement on some of them or not. So these would be the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, the marketing. Some programs allow you to say what portion of it is fixed or variable, where variable means it varies with the level of occupancy. But I think the main thing is just to say, what are the expenses? And usually it's more like $1 amount per square foot, and how much is that going to increase per year? Or it could be some percentage of your rental income. And then something like property taxes, of course, you might project to be level and then a jump up when there's a reassessment. Capital expenditures, this is another tricky one, and there's a lot of different options in the program for handling CapEx, because sometimes it's above the line, sometimes the lender requires you to have some CapEx above the line. What do I mean by above the line or below the line? Does it affect your net operating income on the property? Your net operating income, or NOI, is your rental income minus your expenses. And sometimes one of the expenses is a reserve allowance. And so that would be taking your CapEx or things like replacing refrigerators in an apartment building and other appliances, and saying, well, they last for so many years, so I'm going to take an annual amount to allow for replacements and put that in as a reserve allowance. And if it's above the line, it's going to lower your net operating income. In other cases, what you might want to do is say, well, what I'm going to do is put in a projection of an expense for replacing those items when I think it's actually going to occur, especially if it's a large item like replacing the roof, rather than saying I'm going to set aside money every year, which of course nobody actually sets aside any money every year, right? What you would do is project, well, in year 7, I'm going to have to replace the roof, so I'm going to put that in as a cash flow. Remember the importance of saying it, what are the actual cash flows? So put that in as a cash flow when you actually expect it to occur. So the program allows you to do it all different ways. Sometimes you're forced to have a reserve allowance, depending on the type of financing, especially if it's under some government program. So we allow a lot of different flexibility in how you can put in the capital expenditures. Loan information, I say optional because we might do an analysis without taking into consideration a loan. Usually appraisers, well, it kind of depends. If it's for institutional investors, usually it's done without considering any financing. Not that they don't use leverage on some properties, but just the standard in the industry, it seems, is to value things without the financing. Of course, you'd use then a discount rate that doesn't have financing. For investment analysis that most of you all would do, my guess is your investor is going to want to use leverage, and so you want to know what rate of return is considering the leverage. I mean, that's one of the advantages of real estate, is you can get a decent amount of leverage. Maybe a little more difficult today although a lot of the non-bank banks and debt funds are popping up to provide financing. But certainly, if you can earn more, or at least expect to earn more on the investment than you're going to pay the bank, why not use other people's money, right? So, and then lever up your expected return. We know that also adds to the risk, but that's one of the things we're trying to do with real estate is, take advantage of being able to lever up the return that we might expect to get. So putting in the loan information just involves putting in either the dollar amount or a loan to value ratio or a debt service coverage ratio that the lender is requiring. They may say the debt service coverage ratio has to be at least 1.2 or 1.4. And so that would tend to determine the loan amount. A lot of times it's either a maximum loan to value ratio or some minimum debt service coverage ratio that the lender is requiring. And then, of course, the amortization term for the loan. And then if there's a balloon payment, in other words, the balance is due before the loan is fully amortized. And of course, the interest rate. So those are the basic things for the loan. There can be more than one loan. There can be some other things that might come into play that you could enter into the program, interest-only loans and refinancing an existing loan, et cetera. But that's the basic idea. And then your discount rate. Now, if you're doing an investment analysis, you're solving for the rate of return, so it's not so important. But if you're trying to come up with a broker's opinion of value, I guess I didn't emphasize that. And I'm going to have Jeff talk a little bit about all the different reports. I can't even keep up with all the various reports that we've been adding into the program that make it easy for you to do things like a buyer's opinion of value, a broker's opinion of value, not the buyer. Of course, he's got an opinion, but the broker's opinion of value that you could be doing, and all the other kinds of reports that you could use the Market Edge to help you with. So you might be wanting to estimate a value for the client, and so you need to come up with, again, some discount rate, which, as I've said, is the expected rate of return that a typical investor would want. Or it could be what your client wants. So you're solving for what we call an investment value. You're advising him, okay, here's there's the market value, but there's what you're willing to pay as an investor. They're not going to bid more than the market value. Usually, they might. Depends on market conditions, and some cases you bid more than market value. But the point is, there could be a value to the investor. We call it an investment value that's higher or lower than that market value, and that's what you're estimating for your client. So we'd put in a discount rate, either unlevered or levered, depending on whether we're putting a loan in our analysis. And then if you took CCIM courses or you're a CCIM, you've been drilled into maybe we should calculate something called an adjusted, or the Appraisal Institute calls it a modified IRR. That says, well, what rate can I reinvest the money that I'm getting every year in? Because that may make a difference in comparing investments if I have to reinvest more money in one than another. So you have a reinvestment rate that you put in the program. That's really optional, but it's in there. The program was originally developed by a CCIM for CCIMs, so it's capturing everything that's taught in the CCIM courses. And then same idea with taxes. Your investor may very well be interested in knowing the after-tax rate of return. Real estate still has some tax benefits associated with it. So the investor wants to know, given, we're not doing a turbo tax here. What we're trying to do is just make some simplistic tax assumptions about your current tax rate that you'd be taxed at if you make an additional investment, and what your capital gains are taxed at. And the program will then calculate your after-tax rate of return, and you can see what your effective tax rate is, which could be a lot lower than your actual tax bracket. Like in this example, your tax bracket may be 30%, but if the before tax rate of return calculated by the program is 12 and the after tax is 10, it's really as if you had only been taxed at 20%. And that happens because of the depreciation, the capital gains tax rate, the fact that you're deferring income until you sell the property, deferring taxes, I should say, until you're selling the property. And then it could be tax credits and other things in there. So, and hopefully we'll continue to have a favorable tax environment for commercial real estate over the next 4 or so years. Whoops, estimated sale price. So last but not least, and so the idea here is, like I said, all right, we can go out maybe 10 years. Now my crystal ball is getting a little cloudy, and let's just make a reasonable estimate of what the resale price would be. And the way that it's almost always done, unless there's some kind of option in the lease to buy the property, the whole property, if it's a single tenant property, or a major tenant that has the option to buy, what you're going to see is to say, okay, what's the net operating income when I plan to sell the property, and what do I think a cap rate is going to be at that point in time? And then you just divide the net operating income by the cap rate to get an estimate of value. That's called a terminal cap rate. So we put a terminal cap rate in the program. Usually it's taking cap rates today, and usually all else being equal, you assume it's maybe 50 basis points higher, something like that. There's lots of surveys done on terminal cap rates versus going in cap rates by different organizations. So a lot of good information on that. The idea is that, the property's older, may not grow as fast in the future. So buyers aren't wanting to pay as much for the same income because the income is not going to be increasing as much. And so terminal cap rate's a little bit higher than the going in cap rate. Okay, so let's turn to RealNext. So within the RealNext Navigator, probably most people on this call are already users of RealNext. Just maybe you haven't used the investment analysis or want to see if you're using it the right way. So we're going to go into the presentation and property analysis. It's not called investment analysis because there's so much more that you can do here. And I think and Jeff can add on this, but probably users are using it as much or more to create nice presentations. And that's just equally important, if not more important, to the actual investment analysis. So we call it presentation and property analysis because you can create some nice presentations for your clients. So we're going into that area. There's also the lease analysis, which is a separate type of analysis of just comparing the leases on the property from both the lessor and lessee's perspective. And then, of course, there's a lot of other things as part of the suite, the CRM and the listings and the tour book, et cetera. So we're going to focus on the investment analysis in the presentation and property analysis. And we're going to look at monument office, just as like I said, my textbook example. And you see at the top there, where we have searched the real estate exchange, that's where you can go in and actually find this property. So you just click on that share area to go into the real estate exchange, and you'll see in there an education community area that'll have this property and a couple other examples listed. So it's the academic community. Okay, so you just click on that academic community and then click on the monument office example. Had some tax law changes involved in the 17th edition of the book. So that's why I call this one Monument Office 17th edition. Used to have an earlier edition up there. So, and just a little bit more about this. This exchange is a nice way to send files to your client or the lender or whoever. So you would use either the individual exchange or you could use the global exchange. The idea of the academic exchange is to have examples that more textbook types of examples to help you play around with the program. So we're going to look at monument office, example again in the textbook. So I'm going to be going through a lot of the same things we just talked about, but now you'll see how to put it in the program. But hopefully with that background, try not to be too theoretical, but I didn't want to just jump in to say, okay, here's how to put all these inputs in the program without you kind of knowing, well, why the heck are we doing that? So repeat a lot of things, but looking at it in terms of actually putting it in the program. So aside from some basic information about the type of analysis you're doing and the property type and the address and all that, the most important thing on this page is probably the purchase price. You can see you've got a lot of other descriptive information, which would be important for a report. But if we're doing an investment analysis, what are we paying for the property? It may be the asking price, but it may be what we're willing to pay, and we just want to see what the returns would look like based on, what we plan to offer for the property. Value of the land. So why do we care how much of that purchase price is land value? Well, because only the building can be depreciated for tax purposes, right? So if we're doing an after-tax analysis, if we're not, the land value wouldn't really matter. But if we're doing an after-tax analysis, then we need to put in the land value so that the program knows what the building value is, and then the building value will be depreciated for tax purposes. Resale. So there are some other choices as to how you estimate the resale price, but again, I just about always see use of a terminal cap rate. So you see here, capitalization of NOI is selected and a 7.75% cap rate, probably high in the current market. Depends on the property type though, of course, and the location. So what that's going to do is take the income and divide it by the income in the year of sale. And actually, it's the year after sale. You see a box there, subsequent year, that's checked by default, which is, again, what is just about always used. So what that means is if we're doing a 10-year discounted cash flow analysis, we're going to actually use the income in year 11 and divide that by the terminal cap rate. Why year 11? Well, that's the first year to the next guy. Okay, the value of the property is what your buyer is willing to pay, right? I mean, it's a negotiation thing, but the point is the buyer is looking at the income that he or she's going to start to get. And so we're going to take the income in year 11, divide that by a cap rate to get the value at the end of year 10. So end of year 10, values based on NOI in year 11 divided by that cap rate. Then we have our federal income tax rate. We've got our capital gains tax rate. The depreciation will automatically take into consideration that something called depreciation recapture is taxed at a higher rate. I won't get bogged down into the details of that for now, but the program automatically takes into consideration the recapture tax rate. General vacancy rate. So this is, again, kind of an optional thing because we're going to see that we can put in the vacancy rate for what it actually calculated based on our lease renewals and how long it's going to take to release the property. But sometimes lenders say, well, look, even if the property is 100% leased right now, I want to be conservative and, I want you to have at least 5%, whatever vacancy rate in there. So that's called a general vacancy rate, that no matter what, the vacancy rate will never be less than that amount. If it's more based on the actual lease turnovers, then that'll be used, but it can never be less than the general vacancy rate. So just one of those things that, all this stuff, as I keep saying, is in just about every program that does this stuff. So it's sort of like you got to allow to have a general vacancy rate. That's what everybody sometimes needs to do. Then we have our discount rates on the right-hand side. Again, our holding period, I used 5 years here just because that kind of fits nicely on the computer screen. But 10 years is probably what you'd see most often. Then we have our discount rate that I've talked a lot about, 8% here. Our equity discount rate, which is going to discount the cash flows if you have a loan, that's at 12 because it's higher risk. You'd expect a higher return. Reinvestment rate, I already talked about. If you want to have that modified rate of return in your analysis, you'd put in the reinvestment rate. The passive loss rules have to do with whether you can offset any losses against other income. So you can have yes or no there as to whether you're going to allow for that. State income tax, and then being able to project out your vacancy going forward. That actually started on the left-hand side, where you can put in the vacancy rate for year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. The way I did it here, the leases that are going to be already in existence on this property don't start to roll over until year 4. So I put in 0 vacancy for years 1 to 3, assuming that those tenants are all going to stay till the end of their lease. But again, you could put in a general vacancy rate that says, well, there's still a chance that we're going to lose one of the tenants, and so I'm going to allow for that. I don't know which one, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a general vacancy rate. But you got a lot of flexibility. This is kind of art and science to some extent in terms of thinking about how you want to handle some of these assumptions. Okay, now we have our tenants. So again, we're doing a lease by lease analysis in most cases. For an apartment, it might not be lease by lease. It might be or would be, if you pick that option in the program, more what are the different unit types you have and what's the rent in those units. But it's still a unit by unit analysis, I guess you could say. So here we're doing tenant by tenant. We just have, for simplicity, a bank, a law firm, and a broker. We've got the square feet that they're renting. We've got their base rent. That's what they start off at before any step ups or anything. And then we're going to talk about the reimbursements and the renewals. Those are on separate screens. So there you just have your little boxes that click on to go to those additional screens to put in those inputs. So we're putting in the start date for the lease and the end date for the lease. So it'll then calculate, everything that's happening between the start date and the end date. Notice you can put in rent different ways. I don't show all the other options, but instead of rent on a per square foot basis per year, it could be per square foot per month, or it could be just, but those are the main ways that you would see it. And then if there's any miscellaneous income, you'd put that in. Don't have any in this case. So you can for each then individual tenant, look at any escalations and reimbursements from the expenses. So in this case, we don't have any escalations occurring until the lease renews, but you could have. So in this case, in 21 and 22, we could have an increase in the rents. The expense reimbursements. So this is again where if expenses go above a certain amount, it's going to be passed through to the tenant. So in this case, the stop is actually $4 per square foot, and this tenant has 70,000 square feet, so that works out to be 280,000. You see that little calculator image there? You can actually click on that and have the program do that calculation for you. So you put in the $4 per square foot. The lease might say anything above $4 per square foot. But the idea is, okay, I have 70,000 square feet. So for me, it's going to be $4 times the 70,000, 280,000 is going to be the amount that I put in for the stop. So the owner pays on my lease the first 280,000 of expenses. Anything above that, I've got to pay. Pretty typical to see that in a lease. We all know there's gross leases and net leases and net leases, and this is kind of like, gross lease but expense pass-throughs. Not all of the expenses may be passed through. You'll be able to decide on each expenses. We'll see what the pass-through is. Then we got to put in the information that I've talked about on what's going to happen when a lease renews. So we're saying that it's going to renew in 5 years, and we're putting in an expected increase in the rent. So it's going to increase by $2.75 to give us our market rent when the lease comes up for renewal. Financing. So we've already talked about the financing. You're putting in your initial equity and your loan amount. If you don't put in a loan amount and a debt amount that add up to your purchase price, the program will give you a warning. We could have not asked for the equity, since that has to be the purchase price minus the debt, but we plan to add to the program the ability to handle different types of partnership structures, where there's promotes, and you could have different amounts of equity that get different promotes. So kind of looking ahead at how we want to expand the program in the future. So we have our loan amount. It's a fixed rate loan, amortized over 20 years. The program and calculates the payments based on the monthly interest rate. I think those are the main things here. You can have some reserves that you actually can earn some money on while you're setting it aside. I don't think that's too common, though. It's called funded reserves there at the top. All right, our expenses. We're almost to the end here, the inputs. So for the expenses, we've got property taxes, insurance, utilities, janitorial, maintenance, handyman. You can label these anything you want. There's suggested labels that pop up automatically, but you can change any of the labels and add additional ones. And notice that checkbox on the right, reimbursable or not. Same idea. Notice here the property management fee is not reimbursable, which I think is pretty typical. Whereas when we get to the property taxes, insurance, and so forth, they're all reimbursable. But any or all of these could be reimbursable or not reimbursable under the expense pass-through. This is where it can get a little tricky in reading the lease and figuring out exactly what gets passed through or not. So maybe in a couple of years, we'll just have ChatGPT read the lease for us and tell us, fill out real next for us and put all the information in Market Edge. All right, so why do we do all this stuff? To get our projected cash flows, right? So we've got our projected cash flows each year before tax, and some different measures like our cash on cash return. How much cash did we get divided by the cash we put in equity? Our tax calculations, our after-tax cash flows. I won't bore you with all the details, but the point is you got all your projections that your client might be interested in on the property. We can look at more details of the calculation of the net operating income. So starting with our rents, and we've got our expense reimbursements. Notice that that's added to the rental income because that's additional rent when we get those expense reimbursements. But then we have to actually pay the expenses. So you see all our expenses listed there. That takes us down to the net operating income. We also have our operating expense ratios. We could look at against industry benchmarks for that. We've got a calculation of what we would get if we sell the property each year. I'm not actually a big fan of this. If we're going to have a 5-year holding period, what I care about is what I'm going to get if I sell it in year 5. And my terminal cap rate might have been different in year 1 versus year 2, 3, 4, or 5, because usually it depends on how old the property is. So, but every program seems to do this. So it's in the Real Next Market Edge. But I think our focus is on year 5. What do we get if we sell it in year 5? And what are the tax consequences of selling it for our after-tax analysis? And then I've been suggesting that we change this in the program. It's sort of buried in there that it says PV of net operating income and reversion, a fancy word for sale of the property. That's your market value. If your input as a discount rate is a typical return that an investor wants, that's your market value of the property. And so the program or your broker opinion of value. So for the 5-year holding period, we're saying that this property would be worth 12,400,000 rounded. So, that's our opinion as to the value of the property. That's not the value 5 years from now. That's the value if we sell it in 5 years, but the value today, assuming that it can be sold in 5 years. And then the IRR, 12.88, pretty nice IRR, hard to get in the current market. Our adjusted or modified IRR, which took into consideration the reinvestment rate. And then a net present value is how much is left over if we can buy it at 12 million purchase price. What's left over on an after-tax basis. Some financial indications like your cap rate, gross rent multipliers, net income multiplier, different expense ratios and so forth. Your debt coverage ratio, which the lender is going to take a look at. You can look at more details for each tenant and some nice graphs. So a lot of different graphs here. I just picked out a few. Your cash flow, your operating expenses, breakdown of your cash versus your debt service and expenses, how your tenants in the leases, when those leases are coming over for renewal. So what that looks like for the broker, law firm, and bank. Pie diagram for your revenues and expenses, your lease expirations, so when those are occurring. It's part of your risk analysis. You don't want to have too many leases rolling over in the same year, which looks like you do here. Year 4 looks a little bit vulnerable. If you had a lot more leases in the property, you'd try to manage that to not have everything rolling over at the same time period. And then you could put all of this in a nice report. So I'm just going to flip through a couple of the pages here, but see all that analysis then goes into a report, which can include a lot of maps and pictures. Your cash flows is part of the report, of course. You can select what you want in there. And so, Jeff, could you elaborate a little bit on the different reports? Because that's probably one of the things they're really interested in.
Absolutely, and thanks, Jeff, and thanks everyone for some of the questions that came in along the way that we were able to address. One of the questions that came in, I'll just share with everyone the answer. It's you had so much information, Jeff, about investment analysis and different definitions and some terminology that not everyone was aware of, and they're asking about where they might be able to brush up on some of those definitions. So if you actually go to Guide Me in RealNext, and you'll see you've got a number of different menu options there that help with the training and reinforce some of the things that Jeff talked about. But over to the right, we have definitions and a library of different commercial real estate terms that you might find useful. And if you ever need them, you can come back and refer to. So right inside of RealNext, we give you a nice cheat sheet. Jeff also has his books that he talked about. If you're looking for more in-depth definitions and training, property valuation and real estate finance and investment, Jeff, I'm sure that you can get them on online and take advantage of more in-depth investment analysis training. Of course, the CCI courses, other places to go for investment analysis training. But
yeah, not good. The book was actually listed recently in the list of the best commercial real estate books of all time. So
congratulations on that. Well deserved. Fantastic. Inside of Market Edge. So here's RealNext inside of Market Edge. It's this icon here is the investment analysis. There's also the comparative lease analysis and deal rooms, but this is the one that Jeff was working with. And here you'd see here a library of properties that I have that are part of my portfolio of assets that are we use for different evaluations. And one of the things that I don't think you mentioned, you may have, but just want to reinforce, inside of this, you actually have different scenarios that you can use. So you might model a conservative way, you might be aggressive, you might model it with different assumptions. So your clients can look at it. You might have a buy side analysis, a sell side analysis, however you like to do it. You can do the same thing that Jeff did, but do different scenarios, and then you pick the one you want and add incrementally to that if you want to. And so here it is in life. Jeff had the slideshow, but you just go through, and all the way to the right here is once you want to publish this and create the document. So not just to get the report, but to put it into an OM or a BOV, you can go to your template library inside of RealNext, and we give you 200 200 plus different templates for different types of presentations. And if we know it's an office property, we narrow it down to office, and then some of these are, lease versus buy, sale lease back, and the pure lease by lease analysis, which Jeff did in an OM or a BOV that you could prepare. Jeff, I don't think you went or talked a lot about, but if it's a multifamily asset, the analysis is slightly different. You'll look at unit mix rather than lease by lease, where you could do it tenant by tenant. But if you wanted to see all the 1 bedroom, 1 bath, 2 bedroom, 2 baths, and so forth, you could sort of model those and then look at the different prices, and you set up the structure a little bit different from the income standpoint, and that'll take you through. But if you choose one of the templates, we give you all the pages that are best practice to be included in that library for your analysis to be presented. And so with that one set of assumptions, you then can create all of the different reports and your property summary. So we give you a professionally designed summary with highlights, add photos, maps, the lease analysis, detail, the tenant cash flow detail, rent roll. You can have availability if you want to show what's available and how you'd be showcasing that. And then these different reports. And let me just take it to an output of this and what you'd actually then be able to create. And then one more thing, just the BOV is one that's powerful, and it could stand alone, or you can use it inside of an OM, where you take the discounted cash flow that Jeff talked about and the comps and put that together to create a range of values, and then your recommendation where you can put a narrative in about why you came to that. We bring together the comps, and again, this just supports your data and the assumptions that you made. Here's why I think the cap rate should be what it is because of these other comps in the market. Here's why I think rent should be what it is because of the other availabilities or deals done in the market. And then when you're ready to go and share this with your client or to put it out in an offering, you can just e-publish it, create a PDF, or create an electronic document that would be live. And as you make adjustments and any assumptions or details over time, as clients click the link and access this, they would have the most up-to-date information about that property and that offering. So you can basically copy a link and create the link, attach it anywhere that you can publish things on the web or show up on a mobile device. Your leads would get this type of organized with a table of contents with the separating section pages with all the photos, maps, and then the detailed reports that Jeff just worked on and showed you how to create. So it all comes together. Yeah, this is for shows Remax, but this would be your brand as an example. Whatever if you're with one of the global brands, we typically have that brand built. If you're a local independent, we can build custom templates for you with your design and your look and feel, your colors, and your logo, of course, presented. So all of these details, again, one set of entries that Jeff did, and now here all of a sudden you have a 100-page report to come out that just makes you enables you to demonstrate your market authority and your expertise and your ability to get the highest value for this asset. So that is just a quick sample. And again, you can include whatever pages you want, take out pages if you don't want them, and publish it in a professional package as we've done. Of course, close it with your resume profile and disclaimer, and that is it. So let me just open back up and see if there's any final questions. There was one coming in about AI. We are working on a number of different AI initiatives, as Jeff talked about, some of the things that we can look at, as far as capturing comps and other information from PDFs and bringing information, lease content, and summarizing leases to give you the lease details in a summary way that could be imported as a rent roll and presented, and a number of different initiatives that I think will be value add for you over time. Yeah, the questions about videos and how do we build the BOV and OM. We do have a library of webinars that have been done over time. So you can look at our YouTube channel to see which ones cover BOVs and OMs. We've touched on them in a number of different under different presentation topics. So I don't have the exact name off the top of my head. It's not just a module on BOV or OM, but they're part of creating effective presentations with Market Edge. So look for those and you can find that specifically. And take it from there. Next week we have a mastermind. So back with mastermind, John Merrill of KW Commercial is going to be with us, and we'll be talking about some of the best practices and techniques that he uses to create his, not just a local team, but national practice group. He's a head of a national practice at KW and is going to talk about how his team collaborates across the organization, as well as he runs and builds his business with RealNext. So it should be a great session. And Jeff will be back with us on February 20th with the CRE market update. So be sure to join us for that. It's going to be very interesting to see how the year ended and where we are as we open up the new year with a new outlook. So Jeff, thank you as always for the presentation and taking us all to school today on investment analysis, and look forward to seeing everyone in future sessions.
Thank you, Jeff.